Story 1. About 10 years ago, I got my first job at a nursing home after coming off of active duty in the military. The director of nursing, whom we'll call Dawn, was in the reserves, so we hit it off pretty quickly. I got my nursing license while in the military and had only cared for young, healthy soldiers, not the elderly. However, Dawn and other nurses taught me the ropes. It was a good place to work. I was able to pick up shifts whenever I needed them, made some really good friends, and the residents and their families were generally great, with the occasional challenging ones. When I left active duty, I enlisted in the reserves because I wasn't quite ready to be fully done with my military career. Drill was always the first weekend of the month. Always. I made sure the scheduler had a copy of my drill schedule. After a year, Dawn deployed. Enter the interim director of nursing, whom we'll call Karen. She had an issue with me from day one. I'm not sure why, as I never missed work, took care of my patients like they were family, and had never been in trouble. I just was nowhere near her list of favorites. Within the first 2 months of Karen being there, the scheduler quit. I made sure the new scheduler had a copy of my drill schedule. The new scheduler was cool and was able to change us from 8-hour shifts to 12-hour shifts, ensuring the same nurses worked the same halls for continuity of care. I never had an issue with her. After 3 months, that scheduler quit, along with a few staff members. A young girl from the front office covered staffing for a few weeks until they could fill the position. A nurse transferred from the floor to scheduling. She was a bit scatterbrained but was good at her job and not afraid to work the floor when needed. Once again, I made sure she knew when I had drill. She lasted about 4 months. The girl from the office stepped in again and eventually got the position full-time. I pointed out my drill schedule to her, and she said she understood. By this point, my patience with Karen was running thin. She found ways to make sure I knew she didn't like me almost every shift. She would check to ensure my medication cart was locked 5 to 6 times a day. She never checked other medication carts. Go into rooms and push the call light to see how long I took to answer once again, only on my hall, and always had snarky comments about what she decided I was doing wrong that day. I worked that hall 3 to 4 days a week, 12 plus hours a day. I had that hall down to a science and had the best certified nursing assistants in the building. They were rock stars. Karen decided that I could handle it and pulled my certified nursing assistants during breakfast for dining room duty. I had to do a morning medication pass, check blood sugars and administer insulin to the diabetic residents, toilet them if needed, pass breakfast trays, and feed a few people on my own. I had 34 residents in my hall, and only about 12 of them went to the dining room. I was not happy, to say the least, but I found a routine and was able to knock it out. That made Karen try harder to get to me. Then, on a beautiful snowy Thursday at the very end of January, the schedule for the rest of the weekend, and following week came out. The coming weekend was the first weekend of the month, and what do I always have on the first weekend of the month? Yup, drill. I was still on the schedule for that weekend. The scheduler was nowhere to be found and was not answering her phone. I texted the nurse who worked my hall on days I was off to see if she could pick up, and I would work for her next weekend. No dice, she was going out of town and couldn't. The scheduler finally texted me and told me that I never told her that drill was this weekend and had no one to cover my shifts. I told her that I'm willing to trade the weekend with anyone and work their shift. She texted back that she had no one and that I should have told her about my drill weekend ahead of time. So I went to her office once she got back from wherever she was and, as nicely as possible, pointed to the drill schedule hanging on the wall right next to her desk and asked how she couldn't know when it was hanging right next to her. The blood drained from her face, and she said she would figure it out. I reminded her to tell the other nurses that I would pick up shifts in return if it helped cover it. An hour later, good old Karen came up to me and laid into me. She told me I was irresponsible for not telling the scheduler my drill schedule and that they were not finding coverage for my shifts. I either had to work them or find coverage myself. She asked how she could even be sure I really had drill weekends and wasn't just trying to get out of work, and that she should write me up. She would cut me off anytime I opened my mouth to speak. Once she finished, Karen took off to her office. I'm a pretty laid-back person and usually very calm, but my blood was boiling. I was able to get my shifts covered pretty easily since we were well-staffed. The scheduler hadn't even tried, apparently. Well, she tried throwing me under the bus. Drill weekend came and went. On Monday morning, I brought copies of my discharge papers from active duty, my orders sending me to my reserve unit, about 10 copies of my drill schedule, and a printed picture of the drill schedule hanging on the wall next to the scheduler's desk. I had already found coverage for the drill weekends I had to work for the next 6 months, and even started on finding coverage for the 2-week drill a few months away. After morning medication pass, tray pass, feeding, and toileting were finished, I walked into Karen's office, handed her the discharge papers and the orders, and told her that there was her proof of my military duty. I handed her the picture of the schedule hanging on the wall and told her I should not have to remind them every month, especially when it's hanging next to the scheduler's desk. I handed her the 10 drill copies just in case they needed more since the one didn't seem to be enough. She just sat there glaring without saying a word until I put the list of weekends I had already found coverage for in front of her. Then she smirked and said maybe this taught me how to be more responsible. I smiled and told her, "Oh, absolutely it did, since my time in the service obviously didn't teach me anything, and I'm sure my soldiers would appreciate her teaching their platoon sergeant such an important lesson." Then I slammed my 2 weeks' notice on her desk and explained to her that what she tried to pull was illegal and that I could have the Department of Justice in there so fast her head would spin. As I walked out of her office, state auditors walked into the building. They audit nursing facilities, watch everything, go through everything, and make life difficult for mainly management for a week or two. One of the state auditors ended up being ex-Army. She hung out in my hall just chatting every day I worked. Karen would look at me like a deer in headlights when she walked down my hall. I guess she thought I would purposely get them dinged or something. I was good and just enjoyed her nervousness. I trained my replacement the next week. I went on to the local hospital, and I'm still there. Karen went back to corporate once Dawn came back from her deployment. She learned what happened and reported her to corporate for that and some other things. Karen was fired. The scheduler was fired a few months after I left. It turns out her mother, who was a unit manager, was doing her job. Story 2. This is my dad's story from his time as an airman in the United States Air Force, probably back in the early 1950s. He worked as a guard at an airbase up north with cold winters. He was positioned as a night guard, guarding airplanes next to the runway. Every night, with his jacket wrapped tightly around him, he got up and out to the runway. He patrolled up and down the runway along the long line of airplanes, armed only with a flashlight and a .45 caliber handgun. He was to challenge anyone he came across, like anyone would actually want to be out in the cold weather. One night, his sergeant, who did not like my dad and kept him on the patrol shift, came out to check on him. My dad saw the sergeant approaching and could tell who it was in the bright moonlight. When the sergeant rounded the airplane, Dad called, "I'm here, Sergeant." What followed was a verbal lashing from the sergeant, of course, getting more dramatic every time my dad told the story. The sergeant basically ordered my father to challenge anyone who was out at the airplanes with a sharp, "Halt! Who goes there?" command. The sergeant warned that if my dad did not challenge him in that exact way next time, he would be in trouble and would have even worse detail. My dad didn't like the idea of anything worse than walking guard duty of planes in the middle of freezing weather, so he meant to do just that. Now, walking around all night meant a lot of boredom, and all he had to keep his mind occupied was a flashlight and a .45 caliber handgun. He started entertaining himself by learning to flip the flashlight in the air and catch it, flip it into his pocket, and basically several tricks with it. Next, he started practicing a quick draw with the .45, where in a split second, he could draw the .45 halfway from the holster, turn it sideways, cock the slide, and get it out of the holster. Oh, to hear him tell it, he was like the Lone Ranger with the speed he improved to after about 2 weeks of practice. It wasn't too long before he heard the sergeant out on the runway again, coming toward my dad. Cue malicious compliance. Now, my dad was not really a sneaky kind of man, but he made his way as quietly down the line of airplanes closer and closer to the sergeant. He had made up in his mind what he was going to do. As soon as he got near the sergeant, he jumped out from behind the plane, his flashlight illuminating the person, and his immediately chambered .45 flashed out into his hand with a booming "Halt! Who goes there?" But what the flashlight illuminated was not a slightly scared sergeant. but a lieutenant who was up early to check out his plane for an early morning mission. The lieutenant, upon seeing the tenacity of the guard before him and the .45 trained on him, immediately answered, "Whoa, whoa, Lieutenant Smith. I am just checking out my bird, son. I have an early mission. Do you want to see the orders?" My dad immediately holstered the weapon, flipped his flashlight into his pocket, and saluted. "Sorry, sir, but my orders are to challenge anyone who is found out here next to the planes at night." The lieutenant smiled and answered, "No need, son. Fine job. What is your name, airman? I would like to tell your sergeant he has an excellent guard out here." After the good word got back to the sergeant, he had a little pity on my dad and let him swap out nights on the runway with 2 other guards so he didn't have to be out there every night. Story 3. I worked as a cook at a chain restaurant that had a wing night where you could get a pound of wings at a discounted price. We didn't actually weigh the wings. Our specifications said 8 wings to a pound, 4 drumettes and 4 flats. One night, a table came in, and everyone ordered a pound of wings. A little while after the wings went out, the server came back a little flustered and explained there had been a complaint. Apparently, one of the guys at the table complained that it was obvious he didn't get a pound because it would be a huge coincidence if everyone's pounds led to the same number of wings on each plate. He insisted that the server weigh the already discounted wings to make sure he was getting what he paid for. So we weighed it. Sure enough, it was not a pound. It was 1.5 pounds. We told the server to bring it out and tell him he was getting more than a pound. She said, "No way. He paid for a pound. He's going to get what he paid for," and threw 2 of his wings in the garbage and re-weighed the food. Still over. She threw another one out. Bang on 1 pound of wings. So she brought back out his 5 wings and calmly told the gentleman, "Here are your wings, sir. You were right. There was more than a pound there, so we threw the other ones out. Good catch." When they ordered a second round, he didn't complain that everyone got 8 wings to a pound. On the size of the wings, you can buy 6 to 8 count wings if you shop around a little bit. Like shrimp, for example, wings are sold by their count of pieces per pound. This place made wings and burgers their signature items. Yes, they were very large wings, which were then double breaded. On the fact that they ordered a second round, this is not unusual. If you've ever worked at a wing joint, you would know that people will order round after round of wings. Minus the bones, there is not a lot of food they're compared to, say, a steak or a chicken breast. On throwing the food out, we got staff meals, and no one was terribly interested in eating food that was already pawed over by someone else. Plus, cooks rarely go hungry. There was plenty of fresh food on the line. We certainly were not going to put them on some other customer's plate. Thanks, everyone. Glad you all enjoyed this so much. Story 4. I am a business consultant, and usually during the week, we are at the client site and get paid for travel, meals, etc. The meal reimbursement policy is quite flexible and doesn't limit what we can claim, like some other consulting companies, so we can claim lunch, beverages, whatever. The policy, however, does lay down guidance for a daily limit for food expenses based on the country where you're traveling. I capitalize the word guidance since that is exactly how it is written in the policy. It is guidance, not a hard limit. For the United Kingdom, where my current project is, the limit is 40 pounds per day, which is mostly okay but can be a bit low if you're in the center of London, for example. Now I do intermittent fasting, so most days I don't have breakfast and lunch, just one big meal a day, and have no problems keeping to the 40 pounds, usually around 20 pounds. On some days, I might go to a fancy restaurant, have a couple of drinks with a steak, and run up a £1.60 bill. But during the course of a 5-day week, my average meals would run about £1.30 a day, if not less. I've never had a problem claiming these expenses in my 9 years with the firm. But recently a new project manager, Reed Beancounter, came on board, and he sent back a couple of my expense reports for having meal expenses in excess of the £1.40 for a couple of days, even though the average meal expense over the week was much less than £1.40. I tried to reason with him and told him that it was guidance and not a hard limit, and I was keeping the costs down on other days. He refused to budge and said I could only claim 40 pounds a day for food. So guess what? I started doing exactly that. Every day, I made sure I was claiming 40 pounds or thereabouts for food. I started buying meals for the homeless people around the train station to make sure I could make up the 40 pounds. So now, where I was claiming less than 150 pounds a week for meals, I now claim 200 pounds and get some good karma for it.